For this very important conversation, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Williams, Research Director here at the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Christopher has conducted research on electoral systems, campaigns, political parties, and elections themselves. In addition, he's performed quantitative evaluations of federal government programs under the Department of Defense and Health and Human Services. So, thanks for being here, Christopher, and let's not sugarcoat it. Our country is heading for some pretty rough seas when it comes to evidence based policymaking. How do you see the first 100 days of the second Trump presidency comparing to the first 100 days of his first time in office when it comes to decisions that affect science and scientists?
Thanks for having me. Again, you're right. Let's not sugarcoat this. Um, so the first 100 days, it's really hard to tell right now what it's going to look like. A lot of that is going to be determined by who the appointments are, right? If we end up with, say, Robert Kennedy as Health and Human Services Secretary, it's going to look far worse than Trump 1.0. I do think an important thing here, though, is that in 2017, when Trump took office for the first time, there were a lot of people within his own party and within government in general who didn't fully buy into the idea of Trumpism, right? They didn't buy into these policies. And so his cabinet and his White House was actually stocked with a lot of people who maybe didn't necessarily agree with what he wanted to do. So if you remember this, like Reince Priebus, who was his initial chief of staff, I think lasted less than a year. Um, Rex Tillerson and as the Secretary of State, if anybody remembers that name. Uh, so those people kind of pushed back against a lot of Trump's policy impulses. The first 100 days this time, he's probably not going to make that same mistake for him, that is, of putting these people who aren't fully on board into these positions of power. He's going to choose people who are going to buy wholly into what he wants. And so that is probably going to mean we're going to see more extreme policy coming out of this administration early on. Um, and keeping in mind also that Republicans now have control of the Senate, and it looks like they're going to control the House as well. It's not just what is coming out of the administration, but there are going to be allies for Trump in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Um, so I think there could be substantially more extreme policy being made both through the legislative process and within the executive branch.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. So, are you able to lay out for us some of the real world consequences on government science during the first Trump administration for people listening who they may not be aware or they may not remember? So who or what was hurt and in what ways?
Yeah. So scientists, we at CSD keep an attacks on science database. We go back all the way to the Clinton administration, right? Sorry, no, the W. Bush administration, not Clinton. Um, we go all the way back to the George W. Bush administration, and we can see how many attacks there have been on science within these administrations. Um, and there have been attacks in all administrations, W, Obama, Trump, and Biden. However, they grew exponentially under Trump. I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of these. And what this does, obviously, is it creates misinformation and disinformation, right? Um, so one of the prime examples that seems almost quaint at this point was Donald Trump taking a Sharpie to the hurricane map, saying no, it's going to turn, and he drew that plot himself. Well, okay, at first that almost seems laughable, right? But if we stop and think about what that actually does, that is telling people, many of whom believe what Donald Trump says, that the storm is coming in one direction. Okay, so maybe the people who evacuate because they think it's coming to them lose their jobs. They lose money, right? And then the people who don't evacuate because they think it's not coming towards them actually get hit by the hurricane, right? So these factors matter, right? People get hurt when we have that science uh, affected in this political way. But on top of that, we also
Yeah.
see. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no,
Oh.
no. Finish, please.
Um, we also see a lot of pressure on federal scientists who maybe have their research curtailed, have political pressure put on them, right? So what do? Say, I don't need to stay in this government job. Either I'm close to retirement, I can get out, or I can go find a job in the private sector. And we end up seeing at that point is a whole lot of federal scientists kind of backing out of the federal workforce, right? Which is difficult because we need that science to make policy. So in that case, who fills that void? And one of the big concerns is that it's moneyed interests, corporate scientists who very often aren't necessarily doing the best science because it's a conflict of interest, but they're the ones who fill that void, and that leads to bad science, which leads to bad policy, and people get hurt.
And what kinds of people seem to be impacted the most
Oh,
by these oversights in policy or this blatant mis or disinformation?
so I mean, it's almost always these kind of marginalized communities, black and brown communities, low income communities. They always bear the brunt of bad science first, right? So if we do think about, say, NOAA, right, and hurricanes, right, the National Hurricane Center, um, people who are middle class, upper middle class, wealthy, um, regardless of whether or not a hurricane is actually coming right at you, somebody who is in a middle class job or an upper middle class or wealthy position can easily evacuate, right? You don't lose your job. You don't. Maybe you waste some time and some money on gas, but it's not the end of the world. For people who work, say, hourly jobs, which largely fall on low income people, obviously, but black and brown communities have lower paying jobs and they have more hourly paying jobs, right? So, okay, say a hurricane is coming, but we don't have NOAA giving us clear information as to where it is coming. These low income black and brown communities who work hourly, they can't leave for fear of losing their job. So not knowing if it's coming or not leaves them with a whole lot of uncertainty. And when there's uncertainty, wealthier people can more easily make the safer decision. But those who are in low income communities sometimes have to try and ride it out. And so that uncertainty could actually lead to these marginalized communities getting hit harder.
So early in my career as a scientist, I got the messaging a lot that scientists don't engage in political discourse. And now, fortunately, we've learned that that's not true, and it's not best practice when it comes to operating an effective government. So, how have you seen the conversation change around science and politics since 2016? And where do you see that heading?
So I think it actually goes back to before 2016. Um, when I was in graduate school, a senator from Oklahoma, I believe it was Tom Coburn, actually took to the floor in the Senate, and they decided to cut funding to social sciences through the NSF. Right. So these attacks on science have been going back a long time. And you're right. My training was also, science is completely non-normative. It doesn't take positions. It's just truth. And I still believe that that's the way we should be operating to do our science. Obviously, we don't want politics coming into the decisions we make when we produce science. But what we have seen is more scientists willing to take those positions publicly. Like my research or our research or just the research in general shows X, Y, or Z, right? Okay, so that has implications. And we're starting to see scientists being more willing to say out loud the implications of this are, these bad things. Um, so I do think there has been, over the last 15 years, a movement of scientists away from saying my work is done in a vacuum. I do my work, I put it out there, and let everybody else deal with it. I think more and more scientists are frustrated that their work doesn't necessarily get out into those communities, so they're taking it there themselves. And I will admit, as a former academic, scientists are really bad at this, right? But I think they are getting better, and there are places that help them get better through science communication training.
Yeah, I think we need more of that going forward. And I know that you're familiar with a lot of non-governmental organizations, so nonprofits, NGOs in the international parlance, but they operate in both the political and scientific realms. So for folks who may be new to UCS, how is UCS unique? And what does this mean for our ability here at UCS to affect positive change, to keep people and the planet safe after Trump assumes the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing with UCS is um, we go back to the 1960s, right? We've been around a long time advocating for science and policymaking. We are like the originals here, right? Um, we're the original Coke, not the new Coke. So I think what that does, it lends us credibility to begin with, right? Uh, but on top of that, we are not a think tank, but in some ways, we kind of are a hybrid between an advocacy organization and a think tank, right? We do new, groundbreaking research that is in line with what they're doing in academia, right? And we're using that research to adjust the policy recommendations we're making. Right? We're not relying on other people to do this research and then taking it. We are actually asking the questions and answering the questions ourselves. And this particularly, I can speak specifically for CSD. We are doing this, right? And I suspect in the other programs within UCS, this is happening all the time as well. So I think this is what kind of differentiates us from a lot of these organizations. Um, and a number of the organizations out there that are doing work, actual doing research, they oftentimes fall short on doing like these causal inferential studies, right? It's a lot of descriptive data, which is really useful and helpful for understanding a problem. But isolating solutions becomes more difficult. And so at CSD in particular, we're undertaking some pretty sophisticated inferential research to get at what the causes and effects are of certain policies. And I think that really differentiates us from a lot of other organizations.
Yeah, I think that that does a pretty good job of summing it up, what I've seen from my time here. And so just go with me for a minute down this horrible path of, let's say there's an all-out assault on using evidence and data to make federal policy going forward. Worst case scenario, who and what gets hurt and how?
So you've asked me this question. You asked me this question without knowing that I am a bit of a catastrophizer. um, I have a
Join the club.
tendency.
That's I mean, I'm a disaster scientist, so
Yeah, I have a tendency to look at what's happening and say, okay, what is the worst possible outcome? If everything falls into place, what happens? And just today, sorry, last night rather, I was talking to one of my good friends who is an attorney, and he was asking about tariffs. right? Which is, I realize people listening probably don't think of this as science based and science informed, but economics is a science, and science does inform trade policy. Economic science really does, and political science does as well. Um, so, worst case scenario in this regard, I'm going to go through this and just stick with me, okay? And try not to
Go for it.
cry or
I'm
anything.
I'm listening, all ears.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Donald Trump has said very clearly he wants to put tariffs in place to protect American workers. Well, the problem with this is tariffs create greater inflation, right? So, that Chinese television that costs $300 has a 200% tariff put on it, and now it's over 500, and US made televisions are cheaper. Okay. But, or not cheaper, they're cheaper than the Chinese ones, but the price never comes down. So all we're doing is increasing prices there. This inflation hurts lower income communities, right? Now they can't afford things because of these tariffs. But then it gets even worse because the benefits of this make things even worse. So, great. American companies start making more money because consumers are buying American goods. And what this leads to is greater hiring. Sounds great, right? Except for the fact that the labor pool is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which drives wages up, which drives prices up, and then those prices going up drives wages up more. It's called a price wage spiral, right? And what this eventually does is it leads to increasing poverty, right? Because it gets to the point where that kind of lower third of people, not only can they not afford things, people above that middle class now have to start cutting back on things, and they can't afford to actually do things, right? Food becomes an issue, and when you start to buy cheaper food, it affects your health, right? um on, on top of this, okay, prices have gone up. I need to find ways to buy to spend less money. Okay, I need a new car. Well, a new electric car is super expensive because of these tariffs. Um, okay, so what I can do is I can go out and buy a used internal combustion engine car, which we know produces more carbon, right? So having to cut back and spend less there produces worse effects on climate change, right? This is so when we think about the science informing things, it's not just the EPA or NOAA. It's things like tariffs. Oh, sorry, I meant to catastrophize a little more too. So all these prices are going up and up and up. But there is another problem of China's economy gets hit hard because now they can't sell products. Okay. Well, their economy is already teetering to some degree. Let's say we push it into full blown recession. What effect does that have? Now, China needs to find a way to make ends meet in their budget, right? How are they going to spend money? Well, what do they hold a lot of? Foreign debt, including US debt. So, how can they fill that budget hole? They can call in US debt, which we would then have to either default on or pay back. How do you pay back all of this money? You start printing more money. You start printing more money, it leads to even greater inflation. And it puts the world economy into another great recession, if not worse. So, not following science in this could have pretty monumental effects if all things fall into place right. But if you follow the science
Yeah.
from the very beginning, things aren't falling into place right. So, what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
if this does start happening, buy gold. I'm just joking.
There we go. There we go. No, but I follow. I totally follow. It reminds me of the old it's kind of a poem, I guess, but it's the for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, for want of a shoe, the horse was lost, for want of a horse, the rider was lost, for want of a rider, the message was lost, for want of a message, the battle was lost, for want of a battle, the war was lost, and all for the want of a horseshoe nail.
Yep.
To me, that's how these things unfold. It's just one piece is missing, and then the whole thing snowballs. And
Yeah.
so that was great catastrophizing. And but I want to take it slightly more positive because we don't want this to be the doom and gloom hour
No.
with Jess and Christopher. So uh, tell us how things like federal regulation and oversight make a concrete difference in public safety and health, and who
Yeah.
benefits. I mean, to get back to the insidious part, then who benefits when we take those regulatory guardrails away?
Yeah. I mean, so let's just think about a recent decision to require lead pipes be changed out in throughout the country, right? So no more lead pipes. We have to take them out. We have to put in non-lead pipes. We know that lead is not good for you. Like, you don't want to consume lead. So this rule, this regulation has been put in place. Let's take all these lead pipes out and replace them with things that aren't going to poison us. So right there, regulation is creating greater health outcomes, right? Um, and this also, to go back to kind of this spiral effect, has downstream effects of lower costs for medical care because you're not consuming lead, and this costs the government less money because now they don't have to pay for health care that comes from consumption of lead, right? This is all really good. Um, and so I think that you have these science-based policies and regulations in place, and they do tend to protect the public overall, right? When you get rid of these, again, who is going to get hurt? It's going to be those low income communities, those black and brown communities, right? As a middle class person, I can buy bottled water, right? It maybe it's expensive, maybe it's something I don't want to do. I can filter my water, right? Although getting lead out of water through a filter is really not easy, but either way, I can buy bottled water. Um, you know, so I don't get hit as hard by that. Also, I live in a wealthier neighborhood where it's possible that lead pipes were changed out a lot earlier, right? Um, so it's there is this effect on these most vulnerable people in society again. Now,
But
in
then
this
who
case,
benefits?
who would
Who comes
benefit from
away
this?
with it? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, just who benefits then? Because I mean, it
Exactly.
sounds so bad. Who wants to hurt people? You know, who benefits?
Well, in terms of the lead pipes, I mean, cities are hit hard, right, by having to change these out. Chicago, for example, I think Chicago has more lead pipes than almost any major city in America, and it would cost a fortune for them to have to change these out. So in order to do that, they can raise taxes, they can borrow. So in this case, those who are going to have to foot the bill for that are really not happy about it, despite the fact that they're the ones who are supposed to be protecting their populaces. Right? Chicago is saying, well, it'd be expensive to replace all the lead pipes. Wouldn't it just be easier to let the people who live in Chicago suffer from lead in their water? Right. Um, so that's the first one. But then we look at other regulations. So, for example, car emissions. Right. The EPA says cars need to get X amount of fuel efficiency. Right. The fuel efficiency needs to be X, Y, or Z. Higher fuel efficiency means less carbon output, but it also means less consumption of fossil fuels. So who benefits from that, right? Who would like to see fossil fuels being consumed at a higher rate? And I mean, it doesn't take a genius to realize fossil fuel companies, right? They make money selling fossil fuels. So, sometimes these regulations benefit people as a whole, right? Less pollution, less carbon in the air, trying to address climate change, but there are people who stand to make a lot of money if these regulations are not put in place, and this happens fairly regularly.
Yeah, I think follow the money is always a good thing to live by, I guess, when we're investigating these. Who's pushing what? And we all know that people have said that, oh, well, scientists must be making bank pushing science. And I'm like, I don't know any scientist who's working for Big Green and taking cuts from Big Green. It's not a thing. I wish it was. No, but so okay. You mentioned RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and we have heard in the news that he has stated that he wants to remove fluoride from public water systems. He wants to remove vaccines from the marketplace. And we also know that there are plans to roll back protections of federal lands and to undermine climate change and environmental protection goals. So, how easy will it be for the Trump administration 2.0 to make sweeping anti science changes to public policy?
That's a really tough question, because it is going to depend a lot on what policy change they're looking to make, right? So if they want to change EPA fuel efficiency standards, that's not hard at all. That's executive order, right? Executive actions can do that. Um, if they want to abolish the Department of Education, like they say they want to, which had a far-reaching effects on science, um, that's harder to do. That has to go through Congress. It has to be passed through the House and through the Senate, and then signed by the president. It seems like it might be harder for them to do, even if they do control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Um, just because it is going to be pretty razor thin in the House, um, and I don't think you're going to easily find uh, a majority in the House who think the Department of Education needs to be abolished. At least I hope not. Um,
Yeah, me
but
too.
but then you see other things, right? Like um, some of the checks on policy changes in the Senate, for example, the filibuster, um, which is a minority check, right? And it gets abused. It gets abused pretty badly. And in this current Congress, rather, there's been a lot of pressure on Democrats to get rid of it. They've resisted. Um, I suspect, if I had to guess, I don't think the filibuster is going to survive 2 more years, with this Senate, with the incoming Senate, I should say. Um, and that's another check that probably disappears and makes it easier for Trump to achieve what he wants to achieve. Um, One of the problems that we've had over the last 4 years is getting anything through the House and the Senate has been very difficult. So a lot of the decisions that Biden has made have been through executive actions, and executive action can easily be changed by the next presidency. So I think that there are going to be ample opportunities for Trump to change things, um, certainly through executive action, but maybe even through Congress.
Okay, and you have studied elections themselves, and everybody who is listening, who's a history enthusiast, myself included, we know that the pendulum swings between more conservative and more liberal governments. So, what can folks who are listening do to make sure solid, nonpartisan science of all kinds, whether we're talking economics or climate science or anything else, how can we help to ensure that continues to be funded and used by our elected officials, regardless of who is in office or who's on the Supreme Court?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and it gets kind of at the heart of democracy, right? Um, so I'm going to go back to the founders, right? The whole idea behind democracy is that we actually, I guess, further back than the founders. I'm going to go back to John Locke, so just stay with me for a second. um, the idea is that we as people have sovereignty over ourselves, right? As a just as a human right, but we also live in a society where we need governance. So we use democracy in order um, to determine. We basically give our sovereignty to a democratic government by voting. Right? Say, okay, I'm giving you the right to rule me, make decisions on my behalf. Right? What this means, though, is that we reserve that sovereignty for ourselves, and we can punish representatives, elected officials for doing things that we don't like. Right? Um, and this means if they pass policies that we don't like, we need to turn them out of office. Of course, that means waiting, but it's it's not just that they respond only at elections, right? Elected officials respond throughout their entire term. It's called dynamic representation, right? And basically, when they feel public opinion going in the opposite direction uh, of where they are, right, as on their positions, they tend to change their positions and back away, right? So I think a prime example of this is in 2000, I think it was 17 or 18. It was during the first Trump administration. They tried to repeal Obamacare, right? And public outcry over this was not really. There was a lot of public outcry saying, "Don't do this, don't do this." And one thing that I will always remember is watching John McCain, senator from Arizona at the time, go down onto the floor of the Senate and kill the repeal of Obamacare. Why did John McCain do this? I mean, maybe he was a true believer in Obamacare. I doubt it based on the 2008 campaign, right? More likely is he saw that the public, and specifically the public in his state, Arizona, were going to get hurt by this, right? This was a bad decision that health experts, economists, labor experts were saying this is not going to be a good thing. And he responded. So I think the point here is to exercise that sovereignty. Don't wait till the next election, but make sure that your elected officials know when you're angry, because they will respond when you're angry. And this is also where organization comes in. I can write a letter to my congressperson saying, I hate what you did. This was all bad. And if I'm the only one, he goes, okay. And it goes into the garbage. Probably not. It goes into a file. But either way, if an organization with thousands or tens of thousands of people starts sending letters, all of their members, all of their supporters, and someone's office gets 3,000 letters in an afternoon, well, that's a lot different, right? And this is where organizations like UCS come in handy, right? We can organize this kind of work to make sure the public's wishes are communicated to their representatives. So I think that's a really important thing for us to do moving forward, because working through the process in Congress is going to be real hard. We don't have that much power there. But what we do have is the power to, quote unquote, vote the rascals out.
Yeah, good use of words there. I approve. And so actually, you set up a perfect segue to my next question, which was that UCS is well positioned to respond to the results of the election. I mean, we've been around for a really long time, and we've got a great team of people, and we've been preparing for this worst case scenario, essentially for science. So we really are ready to defend and promote good scientific solutions. So, can you tell me a little bit about what we have been doing as an organization, what we are doing to use science to save lives going into the next administration?
Yeah. So I can speak on behalf of the Center for Science and Democracy, right, more than the other programs. But we have been focused on defense of science, right? We know science is going to get attacked. We want to be there to respond and first and foremost push back against any misinformation. Right? Science is going to be what's the word I'm looking for? Science is going to be somewhat bastardized, right? It's going to be kind of misconstrued over the next 4 years. So the first thing is we have a platform. We can we can talk to the public. There are people who listen to us, who read our work, who listen to what we say, and these people, we can make contact with them and communicate to them like, hey, this is what's going on. And so one thing that CSD is doing is we are um, focused on democratic and electoral reform. And this is a long-term strategy to ensure that science is being taken into account, um, and that all people are being represented. So one thing we want to do is increase fair representation through electoral reform, um, so that we have more choices at the ballot box, that more groups can be represented properly, uh, and that we end up getting a plethora, a myriad of opinions and attitudes and positions, policy positions in legislatures. And this also helps protect against bastardization of science, attacks on science, etc., because it doesn't allow one party to take total control and do whatever they want. Right? It's what we call a consensus democracy or consensual democracy, where these different political parties and different politicians need to come together and cooperate and work together rather than just conflictual, where they say, I won, we're in charge, and we're going to do what we want. Um, so this also protects science, right? Because it allows for more points of input, more actors within a legislature who can listen to different aspects of science, right? Whether it be traditional science or community science or whatever it may be. So yeah, these are the things that we're doing at CSD, right? We're focusing on short term, 100 days. How are we going to make sure that these attacks on science are not being publicized too widely, or at least being pushed back against? And then what are we doing in the long term to ensure government works better and pays attention to all attitudes, all opinions, all people, and all opinions on science?
That's incredibly valuable. And so we're nearing the end. And my last question for guests here on This Is Science has two parts. And the first part sounds a little dire, and it is a little broad considering when we are speaking post election. But here we go. And Christopher, we are the Union of Concerned Scientists. Why are you concerned?
So many reasons. As I said, I catastrophize. My biggest concern, it, I guess there are two of them. As a political scientist, um, I tend to lean towards kind of these social processes as being big concerns. One of my concerns is attacks on elections. And we look around at other countries. So Hungary in Europe, or Venezuela, the South American country of Venezuela. Let's go back to Hungary for a second. Their leader, Viktor Orban, seized power, not seized, he won election uh, about a decade ago, and he has been able to solidify power such that elections really are rigged at this point. They actually are rigged in Hungary, and we know this, right? It's exceptional amounts of gerrymandering, right? Um, and and what he's been able to do is solidify his power in Hungary simply by affecting elections. It makes it almost impossible to vote him out, or at least it would take a pretty massive movement to get rid of him. So this is my first concern, is that over the next 2 years, we're going to see some pretty big attacks on elections. Um, and that I'm not entirely sure that elections moving forward are going to be completely free. That's one of my biggest concerns. And as a corollary to that, or an outgrowth of that, I should say, we know that when people don't feel represented, when they don't feel like they have any recourse to change policy through democratic means, they get violent. This leads to political violence, which none of us want. Right? Political violence is antithetical to democracy. We don't want political violence. But my fear is, if elections are affected in the way that they could be, we are going to see substantially more violence, political violence in the United States. That's my biggest concern.
Okay, and we don't want to end with people thinking all is lost. So the second part of this question is, what are you doing about those concerns?
That's great. I'm going to go back to what I was saying before. What I am doing, part of the reason why I came to UCS in the first place is as an operating academic, right, a political scientist, I was finding I was doing all this research and it wasn't getting out into the community that needed to see it, right? It was in this kind of loop where the people I cited read my work and cited me, and then I read their work and cited them, and we just kept going in this circle. But there's a lot that academics have, political scientists in general, have learned about governance, right? We have the answers to how to make things work better, right? And this is one of the reasons why I came to CSD, to UCS and CSD specifically, is we have an opportunity to use this knowledge we have, this science, this on elections and on governance and on politics, to create a more representative, racially diverse, multi-party democracy. And this doesn't fix all of our problems. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea, but it fixes a lot of them. And so one of the things that I'm involved with here at CSD is working on this democratic reform, moving forward, trying to get the United States to a place where it is no longer a sclerotic, lumbering 18th century democracy, and it is a functioning, representative, multiracial 21st century democracy. And I think there's opportunities for this. And I think the American public is generally in favor of this. They know the problems, they want the solutions. And I think that's something we can give them, and we can fix a lot of the problems.
Thank you so much for your time and expertise and for giving us that little nugget of optimism there at the end. I think we all need that. And I will be paying very close attention to what CSD is doing over the next several months. And I think a lot of our listeners will be as well. So we may be talking again before you know
Yeah.
it, because I'm hopeful that we can keep everybody up to date on the work you all are doing over there. So thanks. Thanks so much, Christopher.
Thank you for having me.